Today, we're going to be going through a scenario where China invades Taiwan. This is a scenario that could happen. I doubt it personally, but it's definitely a possibility. So, we're just going to get right into it and color China in with red. And they are going to declare war on Taiwan, which is going to be blue. And immediately, the US is going to declare war on China because they have a defense pact with Taiwan. And it's basically just going to escalate from here. And there are like pacts between Japan, the US, Taiwan. There's this whole like containment strategy with China. So South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam is an ally, but I don't think they would join the US personally. And India is kind of buddy buddy with the U.S. and they have been part of a bunch of negotiations with them, but it doesn't really seem like the Indian government would want to join this war because it would probably be the bloodiest war in human history, considering there's 1.4 billion people on each side of the conflict. So they're going to choose to stay out of it for the time being. And in this war, North Korea is going to join with the Chinese because it's their prime objective to just take over South Korea and unite the Korean Peninsula. And without China, they like die no matter what. So they kind of have to. Now Vietnam is actually going to join, just because they don't want to be next. Because if China is going to attack Taiwan, they're going to attack other people next to them. And since Vietnam is right next to them, they want to not have that happen. And so they're making deals with the US, and that's being arranged. Also, Australia is going to join because they have a bunch of deals with the US. And so, first of all, China has quite a few ships, but they're not really military vessels. They're more just vessels. Yeah, they're basically just civilian vessels repurposed for the military, which is usually pretty. It's not going to be good for them. Um, and they kind of realize that they're in over their heads in this invasion. And weapons are sent from the US across the Pacific, and yeah, to resupply and arm Taiwan in preparation for the invasion. And there are a bunch of US personnel that move to Taiwan from Guam and their bases in Japan. And yeah, this is basically they're basically just preparing for war, but once they start going to war, it's going to be pretty bloody, considering China. This circle here, like here, contains like 90% of the population of the world or something. That's probably a lie. It's probably like 50. I forget the number. It's probably like 50% though. So it would definitely be a very bloody conflict. So to start, the in the Korean Peninsula, there there will be an advance from the North Koreans just because they have a massive military. And Seoul is right about here, so that's going to be level to the ground, and millions of people are going to die in the first few weeks of the conflict. But just in the first few hours, like I'm going to say about 50,000 people die, just because there's such a military buildup along this quote unquote DMZ that Seoul just will get leveled to the ground. It's not even like, because it's so close, because all the missiles from North Korea are just gonna pile into South Korea and Seoul and collapse it. So with the Chinese aren't really helping with this invasion, and it eventually gets to a stalemate line along like Seoul and this area up here in Korea, and it's Korea doesn't have the best geography for combat, so it's kind of a slog going up and down. And Chinese troops are also deployed along the Vietnamese border. Just to, they're not actually planning on invading at all. They just want to maintain their border in the south. And China kind of like sends their boats to Taiwan, which like they're sending their boats across the channel. But American boats are also coming in pretty quickly. So they are coming in from Guam and America itself, Philippines. They're also coming from Australia. They have a lot of like nuclear submarines and stuff, which are gonna help in this war. And China is probably outgunned in this conflict, honestly, just because of the Americans. So China's best way to win this war is to turn the public sentiment against the war for like the Americans at home. This is what Japan tried to do in World War II. They tried to make it unpopular for the war for the American citizens. But yeah, it depends. Because will America want to risk and like lose American lives over some random like island in the Pacific near China? It's like a whole ocean away. Maybe, maybe not. But it's kind of outrageous to a lot of people in the population. So yeah, I don't think China is going to do very well here. But they eventually will land troops. They eventually will land troops in the, the best places, the only place for an amphibious invasion where it's not too mountainous, where it's not too mountainous to invade. So they'll get there, and then they it's hard to hold them. So they're actually going to lose that territory again, but keep the one in the north, where they eventually do capture a couple cities up here, and they fortify their position with just like a wall. Now this is going to be pretty difficult to like get through. They're pretty difficult to get through for the Japanese, the Americans, and that whole alliance. So in the meantime, they are using their military, their navy, to try to get around and destroy the supply lines between these two areas and eventually kind of like force an invasion through the Taiwanese mainland. That will eventually be possible, hopefully, but in the meantime, they are going to come in and sever these the southern flank, which the Chinese had basically given up at that point, just because they also lost the southern part of Taiwan. So yeah, this in China is very like people are pretty sad about it, just because in China it's way better. Like culturally, people like having sons more, and they're sending millions of their sons to go die in Taiwan. And Xi Jinping, the president of China, is like he's a dictator, but he doesn't have complete control. Like there are still riots and protests against his government, and I think China might not survive this war just because of the like the response to this war and how poorly it's going. Of course, they have a massive propaganda machine, but still, it's pretty like I don't want to say like they're gonna collapse or anything, but they may collapse if they lose like badly. And I mean that's a pretty Chinese thing to do. So, meanwhile, in North Korea, they are slowly advancing along the peninsula and kind of just encircling and sieging around Seoul. And this will probably last a while because Seoul is a city of like 22 million people, which is kind of crazy. But they do end up surrounding it almost. There's a little bit of like passage, but not too much, and they kind of sweep through this area in northern South Korea, which is a weird thing to say, but and at this point, American soldiers have gotten back to Korea, and they have been starting to push back a bit. Um, and most of their priority is to free Seoul, and so they free Seoul of the siege of the city. But it's still difficult to push back in this area of the world, and so there's kind of a stalemate line, like what happened in the Korean Wars, basically. Down here in Taiwan, China is going to keep invading and try to get the northern coast. And their strategy now is to use their air force to bombard the U.S. air bases in like Guam, Japan, the Philippines, and naval bases too, because they want to have aerial supremacy over Taiwan, because the Americans and the Taiwanese air forces are definitely giving China a very hard time to invade in general. So they try to blitz down the coast, which works pretty well. But there is guerrilla fighting in all of the cities they capture, because the people who are being subjugated in Taiwan don't want that, obviously, and they managed to capture a good portion of Taiwan. But this is where American troops are coming in, and they start pushing back a bit, and they use their navy to sort of encircle more, and they eventually start talking with Vietnam and saying like, okay, we need to start opening a second front. So at this point, it's probably, I'm gonna say, a few months in, and so Vietnam, with the help of American troops, starts invading through southern China. And this part is mainly jungle, so they make pretty slow advances. And the Americans actually land on this island, which I forget the name of. It's like, is it Hainan? It might be Hainan. Yeah, it's Hainan. So the Americans land on Hainan, the province of China, and kind of swiftly take the entire thing over. Of course, there's resistance from the Chinese, but the population here is kind of sympathetic to the American cause and doesn't really resist. It's mostly just the government, the Chinese CCP, and eventually they just take over, and that is now American controlled. This is looking pretty bad for China. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to keep pushing more into Taiwan and try to seize it, and then hope that people start, like being nice to them, which won't happen. But I mean, China can dream, can't they? So they keep invading. Yeah, so they get this part of Taiwan, but then they start getting the rest of the country, and they're really pouring everything they have. They don't really have any trade anymore. They're probably gonna go. Yeah, when I said their government isn't gonna collapse, unless something really like a miracle happens, they end up using the last bit of their military force to capture this much from Taiwan. But at this point, troops from America are just coming back in droves, and they go back and capture Taipei back, which is around here, and they go on a massive counteroffensive from Seoul to go back to the DMZ, and they get past the DMZ and go into North Korean territory. Once this happens, there is panic from the Kim regime, who is terrified of, the Americans invading his territory. So he sends an ultimatum to Washington and declares that since North Korea has nukes, they say that if North Korea is to be invaded any further, they will send nukes on Japan, South Korea. Yeah, those are basically all they can do, all they can get. But this is something America doesn't really want to risk, so they decide to make a deal with North Korea that they will not invade them, but in return, they have to cede all the land they took from South Korea. And the peninsula basically just becomes what it was before the war. And yeah, North Korea surrenders, and they're officially out of the war. China is not looking too good now. So, uh, and they start losing the war. The propaganda machine back in Beijing is trying to pump out like, oh yeah, we're still winning, and stuff like, to really boost morale. But it's kind of obvious that they aren't, because energy imports, food imports that are going to China are not actually coming in. So the population kind of just knows that they're lying and that things are going pretty badly, and there are revolts that start. Yeah, so in Beijing, there are riots to overthrow the current administration, and they want to sue for peace. This is also the case in Shanghai, especially Hong Kong, which really wants to just be over. They don't want to be part of China and the Communist Party. Yeah, this is kind of really bad news for China, and they start losing a lot of territory. Taiwan is basically completely owned by the Americans at this point, who start pushing in with Taiwanese troops until the entire island is controlled. But the original patch, which is still heavily fortified, and at this point, America has sent a bunch of aircraft carriers towards the Pacific theater, and they cut off all of China's supplies, and eventually Taiwan goes back into Allied control, which is great for Taiwan. Not so great for China. They're starting to feel pretty bad. In Vietnam, they keep invading, and they stick by the coast just because they can. And up here is basically nothing. They also want to stop China from using the coast to their advantage. There's also an amphibious landing here on this peninsula, which goes pretty well because there are mutinies in the Chinese lines right about now. And as the Americans waltz in, they are seen as bringers of freedom, and they walk along the coastline. They walk along the coastline undisturbed because the people just are tired of this war happening. But China's government isn't going to go down without a fight, so they work to sever this connection here, and they stop the incursion further along the Chinese coastline. Eventually, there are several provinces that would like to secede, and that involves some countries like Tibet, who would like independence from China, and they are gonna just claim independence because they can, and that's about what Tibet would look like. And they just decide, yeah, we don't want to be part of China anymore. We've been subjugated for too long, so they become their own independent province. And the same with the Xinjiang province, I believe, out here with the Muslim minority group. They are also going to claim independence from Beijing because they see the writings on the wall. China is going to lose, and they don't want to be a part of that. And these are also supported by the Americans as independent states. And the Chinese collapse seems imminent, and the Americans send an ultimatum to China that they need to demilitarize at once, and the war will be over under some specific circumstances. And many people in the Chinese government want this, but they don't want to actually answer to President Xi Jinping because he's got the final word on everything, basically. So they don't actually surrender yet. They keep the Americans and the Vietnamese work together to strengthen their clutch over southern China, and they keep moving deeper and deeper. They eventually also manage to get here and liberate Hong Kong, and they are seen as liberators by the Hong Kong people because they were basically just oppressed over like under Chinese rule, and they captured basically this entire area here, and this is looking pretty bad. Since the Chinese have such a massive coastline, defending it all is basically impossible. So there are a lot of attempts at amphibious invasions, and one of the successful ones is near Shanghai. And this is the only reason this is possible is because the Americans have such a massive naval dominance. Like they basically just wiped out all of China's fleet, and they eventually get over here and liberate all of Shanghai and this entire peninsula area thing. Beijing is kind of isolated right now, and two major cities in China have been taken, and so there's no food in the country because they don't have any food imports. There's no oil in the country because they don't have any oil imports, and they're starting to really just collapse. Okay, Manchuria is also going to declare independence from China, and this is just terrible for China in general. The dominoes begin to fall. Yeah, Hong Kong declares itself as independent. Shanghai is also going to declare itself as independent. Eventually, China is going to surrender, and there are some peace terms. All right, so China is absolutely roasted and toasted in this peace settlement. They are basically split up between their main population centers, and older cities are ceded, to put it mildly. So, in the Shanghai, the Beijing, and the Hong Kong area, they all become independent, and China is split between three major areas: north, mid, and south, which also kind of goes along with the river. Tibet and Xinjiang are independent, and Vietnam also gets some territories, including the Hainan Island. Taiwan also remains independent, and North Korea is still alive, but the Kim regime has lost a lot of power because they've lost their biggest ally. So it's only a matter of time until they collapse as well. Yeah, that's about it.